A simple trip quickly spiraled into chaos, but no one could have anticipated the storm that followed. When Melania arrived, the loudspeaker crackled, delivering a final boarding call that echoed through the busy terminal of Dallas Love Field Airport. Sitting near gate C-12 was Barron Trump, his tall frame awkwardly folded into a chair that seemed far too small for him. With his head down and eyes glued to his phone, he tried to blend into the crowd of travelers bustling to catch their flights. At 17, his life was anything but typical, yet Barron had mastered the skill of staying under the radar when out in public. But today, that anonymity was about to face its ultimate challenge. An older gate agent, sharp-featured with an air of impatience, surveyed the area before zeroing in on Barron. The teen's relaxed demeanor somehow didn't sit right with the agent, especially as Barron sat in the priority boarding section. His voice pierced the ambient noise, sharp and questioning. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, startled but composed. "Yes, I am. I have a first-class ticket," he replied, his voice steady and polite, a reflection of his well-mannered upbringing. The agent studied him intently, his eyes darting to Barron's casual hoodie, sneakers, and phone. Then, with a note of skepticism, he demanded, "Let me see your ticket." Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out for no clear reason, but the aggressive edge in this man's voice felt different. Reluctantly, he handed over his boarding pass, where his name was clearly displayed, Barron Trump. The agent read it aloud, pausing noticeably before his expression shifted. Yet instead of retreating, his demeanor grew even sterner. "Wait here," he barked. Around them, passengers began to take notice. Whispers filled the air, building into a hum of curiosity. Barron's cheeks flushed, though he kept his face neutral, refusing to show the frustration brewing inside. Moments later, the agent returned, now joined by a supervisor. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," the agent declared firmly. "We need you to step aside while we look into it." Barron frowned, his voice edged with disbelief. "What issue? I booked this ticket weeks ago." The supervisor intervened, her tone clipped. "We're handling it, sir. Please move away from the gate." Reluctantly, Barron complied, stepping aside as passengers' stares intensified. Some reached for their phones, recording the scene as whispers gave way to murmurs. His frustration bubbled just beneath the surface, his efforts to stay composed becoming a greater challenge with every passing moment. But Barron held his tongue, determined not to make a scene. However, the situation showed no signs of calming down. It was only just beginning to escalate. Leaning against a nearby column, Barron silently watched other passengers board without issue. Every glance from the gate staff, every whisper from the crowd, seemed to weigh heavier on him with each passing moment. Shifting his weight from one foot to the other, he wondered what was taking so long. Was this about his last name, or was it something else entirely? He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this was starting to feel uncomfortably personal. After several minutes, the supervisor returned, his expression as stern as before. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system," he said. "Do you have another form of identification?" Barron frowned, his brow furrowing in frustration. "My passport is in my carry-on bag," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You didn't even check it." The supervisor hesitated, momentarily thrown off by Barron's logical response. But instead of conceding, he doubled down. "Sir, this isn't just about your ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron repeated, his tone calm yet edged with disbelief. "What procedures? I've flown through this airport dozens of times without any issues." The gate agent from earlier stepped in, his voice defensive. "We've had some irregularities lately. You're not being singled out." But his eyes betrayed him, and Barron could see right through the excuse. He wasn't the only one. A few passengers nearby began to murmur among themselves, clearly skeptical. One woman, cradling a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The supervisor ignored her, keeping his focus locked on Barron. "You'll need to wait here while we conduct a further review," he said firmly. "If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate," Barron repeated, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you escalating? I've done nothing wrong." Almost as if on cue, 2 airport security officers appeared, flanking him on either side. Barron's chest tightened, not out of fear, but sheer disbelief at how absurdly this situation was spiraling out of control. The officer's presence drew even more attention, with passengers now openly recording the scene on their phones. One officer spoke in a measured tone. "Sir, please come with us. We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled, his jaw tightening. Grabbing his carry-on bag, he nodded sharply. "Fine." He followed them into a small, sterile room near the gate, the whispers and flashing cameras trailing him like a storm cloud. Inside, the air felt colder, heavier. The officers gestured for him to sit at a plain table, their demeanor professional but unyielding. One officer flipped through his passport while the other observed him closely. Barron shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This is ridiculous." The officer reviewing the passport finally glanced up. "We're just following protocol, son." But that word, protocol, was beginning to sound more like an excuse for something darker. With every passing question and probe, Barron felt an increasing weight in the room, as if an unspoken bias hung in the air. What Barron didn't realize was that someone else was already on their way, and she was far from pleased. In the back seat of a sleek black SUV weaving through Dallas traffic, Melania Trump sat composed, her phone in hand. Her plan had been simple: surprise her son at the airport after his flight. But as her phone buzzed incessantly with text alerts and social media notifications, her serene expression hardened into one of concern. One message grabbed her attention. "Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip. The video showed Barron surrounded by security, being escorted away from the gate. Melania replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper each time. "Driver, please hurry," she said, her tone calm but firm. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron remained in the small, sterile room, staring blankly at the wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out, leaving him alone to stew in silence. Unsure of who to call or what to do, he rested his hands on the table, unconsciously tapping his fingers in a soft rhythm. The door creaked open, and the supervisor from earlier entered, his demeanor still guarded. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," he said, his eyes avoiding Barron's. "It shouldn't take much longer." "How much longer?" Barron shot back, his voice sharp. "You've had all my information for almost an hour." The supervisor hesitated, muttering something about procedures again, before making a hasty exit. Barron let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't about a ticket or identification anymore. It felt like something far deeper. Outside the terminal, Melania's SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. She stepped out, her presence commanding despite her understated outfit. Heads turned as she strode purposefully into the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't need to announce herself. Her energy alone made people move aside. As she approached the gate where the incident had occurred, the terminal buzzed with murmurs and whispers. Passengers recognized her instantly, some even pointing in the direction security had taken Barron. "Excuse me," she said to a nearby airline employee, her tone sharp yet composed. "Where is my son?" The employee blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Ma'am, let me check." Melania didn't wait for a response. She pressed forward, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of Barron. Spotting the room where he was being held, her pace quickened. She reached the door just as the two officers returned to Barron. The moment they saw her, they froze, their faces a mixture of surprise and unease. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with authority. But Melania's presence carried a weight that demanded immediate answers. "Mrs. Trump," one officer began, fumbling for the right words, "this is just standard protocol." "Protocol?" She cut him off, her gaze icy and unyielding. "You're holding my son in a small room without explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" Behind her, the supervisor appeared, his face pale and drawn. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were simply trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained measured, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge to her words. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones you choose to single out?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it seemed to freeze time itself. No one dared speak, but the silence wasn't going to save them. Melania was about to demand answers they simply didn't have. Standing firmly in the doorway, she didn't flinch. Her presence commanded the room, and Barron couldn't help but glance at her with a visible, albeit restrained, sense of relief. Straightening in his chair, he no longer appeared defeated. His shoulders lifted, regaining their usual composure. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor stammered, beads of sweat forming along his brow. "Please understand, we were just trying to ensure everything was in order." "This isn't in order," Melania interrupted, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "You had his ticket, his passport, and his name. What more could you possibly need? A written invitation to board the plane." The supervisor flinched but struggled to recover. His name was flagged in the system, and that required additional checks. Melania tilted her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Flagged? Because he's my son? Or because someone decided he didn't belong in first class today?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, each unwilling to meet her gaze or offer a response. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, pressing on everyone present. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure, ma'am. We didn't realize his relation to you until now. So this is about his last name." Her eyes narrowed, cutting straight through their excuses. The supervisor opened his mouth to respond, but Melania raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it," she said, her tone firm. "I want to speak to someone in charge. Now." Reluctantly, the man nodded and stepped out to make a call. Melania turned her attention back to Barron, her expression softening as she approached him. Resting a hand gently on his shoulder, she asked quietly, "Are you okay?" Barron nodded, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "Yeah, I'm fine. They've just been wasting my time." Her grip on his shoulder tightened briefly, a silent gesture of reassurance. She then turned back to the officers, her gaze sharp once again. "Let me make something abundantly clear," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "You have humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. This isn't about protocol or procedures. This is about respect, or rather, your complete lack of it." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. "Mrs. Trump, we'll make this right. We'll ensure he boards the next flight," one officer offered, his tone almost pleading. "You think this is about getting on a flight," she countered, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "This is about accountability. I don't want whispered apologies behind closed doors. I want them out there, where this all started." At that moment, the supervisor returned, accompanied by a higher-ranking airport official. The official extended a hand toward her, but Melania didn't so much as glance at it. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," the official began. "I assure you will be reviewing this incident and taking appropriate action." "Appropriate action?" Melania echoed, her brow lifting in sharp disbelief. "Does that include addressing the staff who escalated this unnecessarily? Or perhaps reviewing the footage that shows exactly how this unfolded?" The official's face paled. "We can certainly retrieve the footage, ma'am." "Then do it," she replied firmly. "And do it now." The room seemed to shrink as everyone waited. Moments later, the supervisor returned carrying a laptop. He set it on the table, his fingers trembling slightly as he brought up the video. The grainy footage began to play, showing Barron seated at the gate, quietly minding his own business. It captured the gate agent's approach, the unwarranted questioning, and the chain of events that spiraled into Barron being removed. Melania watched silently, her face unreadable. When the footage ended, she turned to the supervisor. "You owe my son a public apology," she said coolly. "Of course," the man stammered. "We'll address it right away." But Melania wasn't finished. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about making a statement. No one, regardless of their name or status, should be subjected to such treatment. Visibly shaken, the supervisor led the way back to the boarding gate. Melania walked beside him, her stride steady and commanding, with Barron following closely behind. The tension in the terminal was palpable. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion lingered, their curiosity now fully piqued as the trio returned. Reaching the gate, the supervisor stepped forward and cleared his throat. His voice trembled slightly, but he pushed through. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the crowd, "I'd like to take a moment to apologize for a situation that occurred earlier today. A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were both unnecessary and inappropriate." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Some exchanged surprised glances, while others nodded in agreement. The supervisor hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to Melania. Her steady, unyielding gaze urged him to continue. "I want to make it clear," he said, his voice gaining strength, "that this young man did nothing wrong. The incident was entirely due to an error on our part, and for that, we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused." Barron stood quietly, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. But inside, he felt the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small or unjustly scrutinized in a public space. Melania stepped forward then, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every person at the gate. "Thank you for your words," she began, her tone calm and deliberate. "But words alone are not enough," she continued, her voice steady but resolute. "This isn't just about my son. It's about the principle of treating every individual with respect and dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room fell silent, her words slicing through the air like a sharp blade. "My son may carry a name that attracts attention," she said, her tone unwavering, "but he is also a person, a young man who deserves fair treatment, as does every passenger in this airport. Let this moment serve as a reminder to pause and reflect before we act. Respect is not earned by status, but by the shared humanity we all possess." Applause erupted from the crowd, some passengers even rising to their feet in solidarity. The supervisor lowered his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. For a moment the airport buzzed, not with judgment or division, but with a sense of unity. As the applause subsided, a woman with a toddler stepped forward, her expression kind. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through," she said softly, her voice tinged with empathy. "It wasn't right." Melania offered a gracious smile, her eyes warm. "Thank you," she replied sincerely. "That means a great deal." Barron nodded in appreciation, still processing the whirlwind of events. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of clarity. It was the beginning of a broader conversation about respect, equality, and accountability, one that would resonate far beyond the airport terminal. As the gate area began to settle, Barron and Melania were escorted to the lounge to await their next flight. The airline staff, now visibly cautious, went out of their way to ensure their comfort. Offers of refreshments and priority boarding were extended, but Melania politely declined. For her, this wasn't about compensation, it was about principle. Barron sat across from his mother, his hands clasped in his lap. "I didn't expect any of that," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Melania glanced up from her phone, her expression softening. "You handled yourself well," she replied. "It's not easy to stay composed in situations like that." Barron shrugged slightly. "I've dealt with stuff like this before," he admitted, "just not so public." Melania leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And that's exactly the issue," she said, her tone firm yet empathetic. "No one should have to grow used to being treated unfairly, whether it's you, me, or someone nobody recognizes. Respect shouldn't hinge on a last name or appearance." Barron nodded thoughtfully, her words sinking in. "Do you think they'll actually change anything after this?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of skepticism and hope. Melania tilted her head, considering his question. "Maybe not today," she said thoughtfully. "But moments like these add up. People notice. Sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up to make others think twice before they act." As they waited in the lounge, Melania pulled out her phone and began typing. Moments later, a tweet appeared on her profile. "Today, my son experienced something no one should have to endure, being judged before being understood. This serves as a reminder to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their name or background. Respect is universal. Let's do better." The post quickly gained traction, sparking discussions online about bias, accountability, and respect in public spaces. Barron scrolled through the replies. Some were supportive, others critical, but most echoed the sentiment that fairness and dignity are non-negotiable. When it was finally time to board the flight, Barron and Melania walked to the gate together. The staff, now noticeably more accommodating, guided them through without issue. As they settled into their seats, Melania glanced at her son, who had already put on his headphones and was staring out the window. She smiled faintly, her thoughts turning to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Barron. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or unworthy. Moments like these are opportunities to teach, to push for change, and to remind the world that respect is not a privilege, it's a right. As the plane taxied down the runway, Melania closed her eyes, replaying the day's events in her mind. It hadn't been an easy experience, but it was one she hoped would leave a lasting impact, not just on those involved, but on everyone who heard the story. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from moments of adversity, and the way we respond to those moments can inspire others to rise above prejudice and embrace kindness. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder about the importance of respect and fairness. Together, let's make a difference, one conversation at a time.